Hello, guys. Let us today talk about the War of Independence that was fought in 1857 to 58, popularly known as WOI. In this video, I'll be covering the causes and events of this war alone, its aftermath, and whether this war was successful or not will be tackled in the next video. Now, the causes and the events before that, let's begin with a brief introduction. You all know that after the British came to India as colonizers, one major challenge that they had to face was in the form of this war, that is the War of Independence. The British had called it as a mutiny, the Indian Mutiny, and it was a serious threat to their domination over the subcontinent, which they crushed with such brutal force that such an uprising was never to be seen in the later years, was seen but after a very long time. To understand what prompted the Indians to challenge the British, we have to have a look at the conditions that prevailed in the subcontinent at that time. Now, the Mughal Empire was losing its so called majesty and was on the verge of collapse. There was internal chaos, there were uprisings within the Indian nation, there was political strangulation, non representation, religious insecurities, and whatnot and whatnot. Until then, that is the coming of the East India Company into the subcontinent, and its gradual penetration into every sphere of the Indian life. The Indians had lived under the Mughal Empire and had a relative control over their own lives and their beliefs and their customs, etc. But when the British crept in, things changed completely and very drastically. Now, this change was unbearable for the Indian people in a certain way, and this, to a large extent, paved way to the War of Independence. Now, the historians have divided the causes of the War of Independence into four categories. That is the political cause, the religious and the social cause, then there is the military cause, and there is the economic cause. Now, I'll be discussing each one of them in detail. I have made certain mind maps so that it becomes easier for explanation and understanding. Let us discuss the causes of the war individually. Firstly, the political cause. Now, the then Governor General, Lord Dalhousie, introduced the doctrine of lapse. What was the doctrine of lapse? According to the doctrine of lapse, if a ruler died without leaving a natural heir to his throne, his land would be annexed. And on this pretext, the British annexed Satara, Nagpur, and Jhansi. However, the story of Oudh was a little different. The Nawab of Oudh had died in 1856, but this Nawab had surprisingly left several heirs to his throne, but the British declared that since he was not governing his land properly, so they annexed Oudh as well. Now, there was a lot of mistreatment meted out to the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar at that time. He was made to leave the Red Fort of Delhi, and that was considered as derogatory by the people of India. And then there were lack of opportunities for the natives in the civil service. To be more precise, no opportunities at all for many deserving candidates as well. In 1834, English was made as the language of administration. In 1835, English was replaced, Persian language as a language of education. Now, Persian language, when it got replaced by the English language, this caused a lot of resentment. Why? Because Persian language was very dear to the Mughals, and a lot of great works of literature and poetry were written in this language. Okay, now coming on to the religious and the social causes. Initially, though, the British had concerned themselves with the trade only, but gradually they did, they started to spread their culture and their religion, coming up, with the idea of the white man's burden. Civilizing the entire race of the world and spreading their superior culture was considered as a duty, of the British. So, they started to take steps in that direction. Now, they distance themselves socially with the general population, the Indians, and they consider them as an inferior race. They had come up with a new way of life, and that is the introduction of railways, roads. But some of these technological advancements, were unacceptable to the orthodox Indians. So that also created a lot of trouble. The Christian missionaries also entered into India. Now, there were rumors of forceful conversions, and they also started setting up of schools, Christian schools, to be more particular. Then this all was considered as a threat to Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism. Then sati was, which is a custom of the Hindus, was banned in 1829. And then finally the introduction of the grease cartridges, which we'll be discussing on later on. No, that also provoked, religiously provoked the Indians. Okay. Now let's begin with the economic causes. Economically, Indian society was exploited to the maximum. Raw materials were bought from them for nothing, and goods were sold at an extremely high prices. There were high taxes imposed on all the goods, and then the salaries of the infantry was very low, and infantry was mostly the natives. Then the peasants and the small landowners, they suffered the most because they could not pay the taxes. Now coming on to the military causes, the infantry and the cavalry. The infantry are the sepoys and cavalry are the sowers. The infantry are the foot soldiers. The cavalry are the ones on the horseback. Now they were exclusively Indians, whereas the officer class was exclusively British. Now this was a major reason for resentment of the Indian people, because they're living in on the Indian soil, but they are living a life of slaves. Now, there were also rumors of forceful conversions within the army, and finally, the introduction of the grease cartridges, which we'll be discussing when I discuss the events in detail. Now, so these are the main reasons which resulted in can be considered as the causes of the War of Independence. Now, beginning with the events. The war officially began in January 1857 with the introduction of a new rifle that was called as the Enfield P53. Now, what was wrong with this rifle? It was this paper. To keep the powder dry, it was covered with a greased paper. Now, the grease came from the fat of the cow and the pig. Now, this rifle had to be bitten off, technically bitten off at one end, before loading it. Now, now this cartridge had to be bitten off. Before loading it, it had to be bitten off. Now, cow was an animal is an animal which is sacred for the Hindus, and pig is an animal which is unlawful for the Muslims. So it hurt the sentiments of both the nations. Now, in March, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey, he defied the British and he was executed. He had refused to use these cartridges. In May, sepoys in Meerut refused to touch the cartridges, and they were court-martialed and they were put in prison. However, their fellow soldiers, they broke in and they freed them. Now, these fellow soldiers, they formed their own army and they sacked Meerut. The British officers were put to death. Now, these revolutionaries or these soldiers, they marched to Delhi and they captured it. Bahadur Shah Zafar too, he became a unifying symbol of this battle, of this War of Independence, and he was a figure who was uniting at that time the Hindus and the Muslims, all of them, because they had a common enemy at that time. Now, British in this battle, they started losing their pockets of control. That is, they lost Mathura, Kanpur, Allahabad, Delhi, Lucknow. That is practically the whole of present-day Uttar Pradesh fell into the hands of these revolutionaries. In September, the British regained, however, control of Delhi, and Bahadur Shah Zafar, he surrendered without any resistance. Now, why was that so? When we discuss the aftermath of the battle and we discuss why this war actually failed, you will get to know that there were certain problems with this battle, and this resulted in the British regaining control of Delhi. His sons, Mirza Mughal and Mirza Sultan, Mirza Abu Bakr, they were all brutally murdered. Their heads were decapitated and presented to Bahadur Shah Zafar. It was a horrendous act committed by the British, and in this manner they regained Lucknow as well. Jhansi was another pocket of opposition. It was a main pocket of opposition area. And there, there was a leader by the name of Lakshmi Bai. She was a girl, a woman, but she used to dress up as a man and lead sepoys in the battle against the British. She was killed in June 1858. And, by the end of August 1858, the whole of the war, it had come to an end. Now, with this, we can conclude today's talk, which was on the causes and the events of the War of Independence. The aftermath and why the war failed will be discussed in the upcoming video. I hope this video was beneficial for you, and if you found it beneficial, please subscribe to my channel press the like button, share it with your friends, and if you have any doubts, any queries, you can put your queries in the comments below. I'll be more than glad to answer your queries. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.